I've never been one for working in busy offices, dealing with customers, or anything like that. It's not that I'm an unfriendly person, more so that I'm restless. I just couldn't hack my busy, people filled job anymore. So before I flicked a switch and lost it, I quit. It's that impromptu decision that led me to find a new job that suited my current needs, and in doing so, ended up tangled in a living nightmare. After a couple of weeks with no income, I was behind on my rent. My roommate was irked at me, and I was surviving off of soup and pasta. I'd called around a lot of places about jobs. Night shelf stacker, night porter, security guard. As long as it was low on people, I'd take it. But there seemed to be zero jobs like that available. I was at the point where, after eating pasta for 14 days straight, I was about to give in and get another office job. I was literally dialing the number for this office I knew had jobs going when my phone beeped through a message from a strange digit 5 heavy number. Benjamin Hastings, your job application for night watcher has been successful. Be at the given address at 2100 hours. I figured that applying for hundreds of jobs had finally paid off, so I gave a fist punch in excitement. Then I started to type out a reply when a list of instructions buzzed through. Wear all black. No color is permitted. If you have hair any shade other than black, then a black cap must be worn at all times. No food and drink to be consumed on the premises. Do not acknowledge the janitor. No words, no eye contact. Phones, wallets, car keys, and all jewelries must be left in the lockbox before entering the room. Leave promptly at 0500 hours. Collect all belongings and pay package from the lockbox. Do not reply to this number. I know it sounded weird, but hey, I was desperate, and I couldn't deny that a night job where I was specifically instructed not to talk to anyone sounded appealing. I searched my closet for all black clothing and borrowed my roommate's black cap. Then I realized something. I hadn't been sent the address. I stared at the number. I know it said not to reply, but I needed to know where to go. I don't know, this whole thing was starting to sound suspect, and I thought it might be one of my friends messing around. But just before I replied to the number, or went and accused any of our friends of setting this up, another message came through. Unit 5, Allcourt Road. I looked up the address. It was about a 30-minute drive from where I lived. Yeah, so the instructions were weird, but it's not like I had a better offer, so I changed into all black clothes and drove out there. The closer to the location I got, the more into the wilderness I seemed to become. Like seriously, I hadn't seen a house for what felt like miles. Then about a mile out, my sat-nav bugged out. I was starting to panic, thinking I'd never find this stupid place, and I wasn't allowed to ring the number for assistance, not that I had any signal anyway. Then suddenly this curve in the road came out of nowhere. It's a sweet miracle I jammed on the brakes in time and managed to swerve. This rattled me, so I drove extra slowly and then saw this handwritten sign that said Unit 5, followed by a right-hand arrow. I had to reverse, then squint to see the narrow dirt road amid the massive trees. Eventually, the dirt road ended and this dark green warehouse came into view. Mine was the only car there, so I parked up, quickly ate an energy bar, then walked up and down the front of it trying to find the door. By this point, I was past thinking my friends were behind this. No way were they smart or dedicated enough to come up with something like this. I thudded my fists against the wall and shouted, "Enough already, open up!" Then my alarm went off. I set it for 2100 hours. This was it. I thought I'd be fired before I even started as I couldn't find the damn door. I was about to call it quits and storm back to my car when I heard this strange clicking sound. I looked ahead and saw a patch of light. I cautiously walked over to it and stared in confusion. A door was open, but I swear I hadn't spotted anything there a few minutes ago. Nor had I seen the open lockbox protruding now from the wall. I told myself it was dust, so I probably hadn't seen it in the graying sky. As I placed my phone, wallet, car keys, and my silver chain in the box, I felt this inkling that something was up with this place, but I forced myself to ignore it. Even when I stepped inside and the door slammed shut behind me, and when I found myself in this long stretch of corridor with a row of doors about 6 feet apart on either side of it. Hey, I was burned out with people and I was down to my last $10, so being paid to stay here all night felt like a piece of cake. There were no instructions on what I was meant to do and nowhere to sit down or anything, so to try and calm my nerves, I started pacing up and down that corridor. I counted about 50 doors on one side alone before I lost count. The warehouse hadn't seemed so big from the outside, but that was the thing with places like this. I don't know how or what resulted in it, but the spatial awareness was usually off. I walked up and down the corridor until my feet ached. There were no windows in that place, only this dim, artificial light that gave me eye strain and caused my head to ache. Being in a place like that, I couldn't help but wonder what was shut away in those rooms. I didn't have a gun on me. Hey, I didn't even have a phone, so if someone tried to burgle the place, what was I meant to do? Tackle them to the floor or something? I continued walking. With no phone or windows, I was oblivious to how long I'd been there or how long of a shift I had left. I felt like I was in a time warp of a seemingly never-ending corridor and pacing up and down and up and down. As weird as it was, at this point, I still preferred this to working in that darn office with the clattering of objects, distracting footsteps, and excruciating small talk. I just completed another patrol of the corridor and stopped against a wall to grab a break when I heard what sounded like the unlatching of an old bolt lock and the creaking of a door. I've never shot into alert mode as quickly as I did at that moment. "Hello?" I said in almost whisper. "Hello? Is someone there?" I knew I wasn't imagining it. I heard what I heard. Knowing I needed to investigate, I tried my best to ignore my heart thudding beneath my black jacket and force myself to do my job and walk along the corridor. At first, nothing stuck out as different. All the doors were shut. I even reached out and tried one, discovering the true force of its solid metal structure on touch, and as suspected, it was locked. I was about halfway along the corridor when I stopped dead. I swear a blur of something just shuffled up there, but when I looked again, I couldn't see anything. I blinked my eyes and blamed it on a trick of the light, but as I walked the rest of the way, I felt uneasy. And then I saw it. One of the doors was wide open. My legs shook beneath me, and I had to cling onto the doorframe not to fall onto my butt in shock. "Hello?" I croaked out. "I'm the night watcher. Is everything okay?" Silence greeted me. No way was I stepping into that room, but curiosity got the better of me, so still clinging to the grimy doorframe, I stuck my head in there and peered around. The room was windowless and the size of a small cell. To the far side of the room was what looked like a flat cardboard box. It was dirty and tattered and covered in stains that I didn't want to think about. In the corner of the room was a bucket. I could smell it from here, rancid and festering. The smell was so vile, I felt the phlegm rise in my throat and had to place my hand over my nose and mouth to force it down. I was about to get as far away from that room as I could when I noticed something different about the wall behind the cardboard box. I squinted to get a closer look, but I couldn't quite make it out, so I wedged my booted foot in the doorway and leaned forward. It didn't help that the only light in there was from the corridor. Otherwise, the room had been completely submerged in darkness. There was an indent there. A brick was missing, making a strange sort of shelf, and there were objects on it. I couldn't quite make out what they were, but if I'd stretch over as far as I could, if I wanted to see what was on that shelf, then I'd have to fully step into the room. No chance. I didn't want to find out what it was badly enough to do that. I managed to half-step, half-stumble back into the corridor and bring the door ajar before I coughed out nothingness and peered up that infinite corridor. I heard it first, then whistling. Then I saw it. I wasn't alone in this corridor. There was someone here with me. I gripped the wall and stared forward, taking in the gloomy figure further ahead. A dark shawl of some sort covering their head and shoulders. They held a broom in their hands, and when I realized they were sweeping the floor, all the while whistling an unknown tune as they moved forward up the corridor. I pressed myself to the wall, not knowing what to do or say. I stayed there frozen in fright and uncertainty. As they came closer to me, I saw one of their frail arms, stretched skin over jutting bones, moving with each sweep. I couldn't help but stare, my face twisted in disgust. That's when I realized something had changed. Silence replaced the whistling. I scanned my eyes across the frail shape and to a pair of circular glazed black eyes on a gaunt face. Their broom hovering above the concrete floor, their eyes fixed firmly on me. I started to say. Then I remembered one of the rules. I wasn't meant to acknowledge the janitor. No words, no eye contact. I stopped talking, but it was too late. They wouldn't stop looking at me with those haunting eyes, and for all my efforts, I seemed to find it impossible to look away. Then they made this strange hissing sound as they lunged forward on their skeletal frame and reached out to grab at me. I ducked out of the way, only just managing to dodge them. Then I stepped to the side and leaned back, pressing against the ajar door and finding myself tumbling backward into that rancid dark room. They paused in front of the doorway, lingering there unmoving as I stayed silent, my hand pressed to my mouth to catch my breath. I refused to meet their gaze, my eyes lowered on the tatty black fabric that flowed loose around their legs and their gnarly, dirt-covered bare feet. They began whistling that unknown tune before they moved away from the doorway and continued their sweeping. I stayed there, ridged and breathing manically for I don't know how long. Time lost all meaning in this place. It was only when the whistling became a distant echo that I forced myself onto shaky feet. I peered around the room, and in the dim light I caught sight of the spot where a shelf within the brick was. I'd come this far, so I knew I had to check it out. So I leaned over that flat cardboard box the best I could without touching it. There were 4 objects, each larger than the last and lined perfectly straight. A dead spider, shrunken and shriveled. A dead woodlouse, static and stiff. A nail, old and rusty, and lastly, a finger. Human-looking, with a bloody indent where the fingernail should have been. I jerked backwards, stretching my hands behind me and touching the cardboard. Registering what I was touching, I jumped to my feet, furiously wiping my hands down my black pants. I blocked the smell with my arm and took one last look at the creepy shelf of keepsakes before I stepped backward out of there, then almost fell out into the corridor. I knew I needed to get out of that place and fast, so I rushed up the corridor, disoriented and hoping I'd pick the right direction. I didn't know anymore. My mind was a blur of unknowns. I kept on walking until I heard it, that whistling. That janitor, or whoever that was up ahead, a shadow aimlessly sweeping in the dim light. I couldn't go back the other way. I didn't want to end up in the depths of this place. I needed to get out of there. I held my breath. I stared at the scuffs on my boots, and I didn't stop looking at them as I walked forward. The whistling grew louder, combined with barefoot steps and the monotonous sweeping. I stepped to the side, narrowly avoiding the pile of dirt that just swept there. Then I kept on walking without stopping until their whistling grew quieter. It was only then I dared to catch a breath, the fetid smell traveling with me and causing me to cough so much I missed my footing. I tripped over my own feet, causing my cap to fall off. The whistling stopped. Panic rose inside of me as I didn't dare look up, but even though I couldn't see those glazed black eyes, I felt them fixated on me, on my visible chestnut brown hair. I heard a clattering of wood to the ground and a scuttling of feet. I reached out my hand and desperately patted the floor for my cap, sensing that thing nearing me as I finally gripped the back of the cap and quickly fixed it in place on my head. Silence. Silence, and then the whistling started up again. I shuffled along the corridor out of that crazy sweeping path, but I didn't dare look upward. I didn't stop shuffling, not until I reached the wall, the shut, doorless wall. Then I stared at my boots and I waited for something, anything. The thick tickled at my dry, coarse throat, but I had no liquids due to this rule. This place and its insane rules. I honestly thought I was going to die there. I was going to die and no one would ever find me, ever know what had happened to me. I didn't know how long I sat there holding my breath in bursts and pressing a trembling hand to my boot. It felt like days, torturous, unending days. A ringing sounded out. At first, I thought I was imagining it, so I didn't react. When the sound didn't stop, I made myself turn around and peer at the wall. The door had reappeared, opening away to the outside. Dark gray and not quite sunrise. I managed to pull myself up to my feet and step out of the warehouse. The lockbox was there, open, my belongings on show. I grabbed them with fumbled hands and shoved everything into my jacket pockets before they fell through my shaking fingers. I moved, fueled only on adrenaline. I hurried over to my car and somehow managed to pull my keys from my pocket and unlock it. Once in there, I pulled my mug of cold coffee out of the drink holder and gulped down at the cold dregs. Then I pulled out my phone and stared at the time, 5:05. I had an unread message from that strange number, one sent at exactly 0500 hours. Due to an insufficient following of the rules, your job position of night watcher is terminated. "Do not return for your next shift." I laughed when I saw that, as if I would ever have gone back to that job. No way in hell. I drove along that narrow road and let my instincts somehow guide me back to the city. Later, when I checked my pockets, I found I'd stuffed a blank envelope in there. It had $500 in it. At least I'd come out of that nightmare with something. It was only afterwards that something dawned on me. There were no locks on the outside of those rows of doors, but I heard that bolt unlock. This must have meant that those bolts were on the inside of the doors, and that creepy janitor, if that's who they were, let themselves out of that room to go to work. Sometimes when my thoughts linger back to that night, I wonder if I hadn't broken the rules and had my job terminated, if I would have ended up in one of those rooms, mindlessly letting myself out of it to carry out my work shift. It took me years before I finally mentioned what happened to anyone. Holding on to something like that ate me up inside. Eventually I cracked and I told my brother everything. I didn't expect him to believe me, but to my surprise, he didn't make any jibs. Instead, he said it was time I had closure. So he made me get into his car and drove us out to Allcourt Road. The thought of going back to this warehouse and facing whatever it was that inhabited it terrified me. My brother drove along the swerve of the road countless times, but no matter how hard I looked, there was no handwritten sign and no narrow dirt road. We even parked up and walked past the trees. After no sign of the warehouse, we eventually gave up and left. I expected my brother to groan at me for wasting his time, but again, to my surprise, he didn't. When I later asked him about this, he said he knew I wasn't lying, as he could tell from the petrified look in my eyes. No one could fake that pure, undiluted fear. That place will always plague my mind. It resulted in me struggling to trust people, and I've never been able to do a night shift job since. Since then, I've started a business with my brother, and it's going pretty well. But he says that on occasion, I just stop what I'm doing, my eyes glaze over, and I stare at the wall without blinking. Sometimes for moments, sometimes for minutes. I don't remember doing this, and I don't know what it means. I know my brother's not joking around about, as when he mentions it, I see it. I see the fear in his eyes.